Kendrick Vale wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. At 34, he'd spent most of his life trying to do things the right way, showing up on time, keeping his word, working hard without making a scene. That morning, he'd wrapped up a week-long project in Atlanta, one that had kept him burning the midnight oil more nights than he could count. Now, all he wanted was a quiet flight home to Seattle, a hot shower, and maybe a few hours with his nephew before the real world came knocking again. He'd booked his ticket weeks in advance, like always. Not because he loved planning, but because last-minute chaos made him anxious. When the seat map popped up during checkout, he clicked on 12C aisle near the front, close enough to the exit that he wouldn't be stuck waiting while half the plane shuffled off ahead of him. It wasn't a luxury choice. It was practical. He had a bad knee from an old soccer injury, and standing in cramped lines wasn't his idea of a good time. The airport that morning was its usual blur of noise and motion, rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, the low hum of tired travelers dragging themselves toward gates. Kendrick moved through it like he always did, calm, observant, keeping to himself. He bought a black coffee from a kiosk, no sugar, and sipped it slowly as he waited to board. He wore a soft gray hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention. Just a man heading home after a long week. Flight 417 was a mid-sized jet, clean and modern, with that faint smell of disinfectant and recycled air that all planes seem to share. He stowed his small duffel in the overhead bin, slid into 12C, and buckled up. The seat felt firm but comfortable. He pulled out his paperback, a dog-eared copy of a James Baldwin essay collection he'd been rereading, and settled in. Outside the window, ground crew moved with practiced efficiency. The engines hummed to life. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. Then the plane pushed back from the gate. It wasn't long before the first flight attendant appeared, Lorna Briggs. She looked to be in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun and a uniform so crisp it practically crackled. Her smile was polite but didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved down the aisle with the kind of practiced grace that comes from years in the air, checking seatbelts, offering water, answering questions without breaking stride. Kendrick barely noticed her at first. He was lost in a passage about dignity and space, how black people are often asked to occupy less of both in public life. The irony would hit him later. When Lorna reached his row, she paused. Not long, just a beat too long. She glanced at his seat number, then at him, then toward the front of the cabin. Her expression shifted just slightly. The polite mask stayed on, but something underneath it tightened. "Sir," she said, voice low but clear, "we've had a request from a passenger. Would you mind switching seats? Just one row back, 13A, window seat. The lady traveling with her children finds your current seat uncomfortable." Kendrick looked up, confused. "Uncomfortable how? I haven't done anything." No, of course not," she said quickly, holding up a hand. "It's just, she's traveling alone with 2 young kids, and she mentioned she'd feel more at ease if you weren't right behind her." He frowned. He turned slightly to look forward. 2 rows ahead sat a white woman in her late 30s, dressed in a cream-colored sweater, scrolling on her phone. She hadn't looked back once. Her children, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8, were watching a tablet, headphones on, completely absorbed. There was no indication of distress, no fidgeting, no glances over the seat. Nothing. "I'm in an aisle seat," Kendrick said gently. "She's facing forward. I'm not even in her line of sight." Lorna's smile didn't waver, but her eyes darted toward the cockpit. "I understand, sir, but it's a simple request. We'd really appreciate your cooperation." Something about the way she said, "appreciate your cooperation," made his stomach tighten. It wasn't a question. It was a soft command wrapped in courtesy. He'd heard that tone before, in stores, in meetings, in places where people expected him to nod and step aside without asking why. He took a breath. "Did she specifically ask for me to move? Or is this your interpretation?" Lorna hesitated. Just a flicker. She expressed concern. "We're just trying to make sure everyone has a pleasant flight. By asking one passenger to give up his paid seat because another feels uncomfortable, without any reason." A few nearby passengers had started to pay attention now. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat. A woman in 11B glanced between them, then quickly looked down at her magazine. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Kendrick said, keeping his voice even, "but this doesn't feel right." If there's a safety issue, fine. But if it's just a feeling, then why me? Lorna's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Sir, this isn't a negotiation. Either you comply or we'll have to consider your behavior disruptive. The word disruptive landed like a stone in still water. Kendrick felt the weight of it, the implication that his mere presence, his refusal to quietly disappear, was enough to label him a problem. He thought about his grandfather, who'd been turned away from diners in the 1950s simply for being black. He thought about his college years, when security followed him through bookstores just in case. He thought about how even now in 2025, he still sometimes rehearsed his tone before speaking to authority figures, making sure it was calm, respectful, non-threatening, just to avoid being seen as angry or aggressive. And here he was, on a commercial flight, being asked to move from a seat he'd paid for, not because of anything he'd done, but because someone else felt uneasy about him existing nearby. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He just looked Lorna in the eye and said, "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant or the captain, please." Her expression changed then, just slightly. A flicker of irritation quickly masked. "I'll inform the captain," she said, and walked away without another word. For the next few minutes, Kendrick sat perfectly still. He could feel the eyes on him, the curious, the nervous, the judgmental. Someone whispered, "Just move, man." It's not worth it, but to him it was. Because if he moved now, what message did that send? That it was okay to be treated this way? That his comfort, his rights, his dignity were negotiable? The captain arrived 10 minutes later. Dale Henshaw was tall, broad-shouldered, with a military-style haircut and a voice that carried authority without needing to shout. He leaned down slightly to speak to Kendrick, his tone firm but controlled. "Mr. Vale," he said, having clearly been briefed, "we've received a concern from a passenger regarding your proximity. For the sake of everyone's comfort, we're asking you to move to seat 13A. "I haven't done anything wrong," Kendrick replied. "I'm in my assigned seat. I haven't spoken to her, looked at her, or made any gesture. Why am I being singled out?" The captain's jaw tightened. "This isn't about right or wrong. It's about maintaining a peaceful cabin environment. If you refuse, we may have to divert this flight and have you removed." Kendrick felt a chill run down his spine. Divert the plane over this? He knew airlines had broad discretion when it came to disruptive passengers, but this felt like a gross misuse of that power. Still, he stayed calm. He pulled out his phone. "Do you mind if I record this conversation?" he asked. The captain hesitated. "You're within your rights," he said finally, though his expression darkened. Kendrick hit record. He didn't do it to provoke. He did it because he knew deep in his bones that if this went sideways, no one would believe his version unless there was proof. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," he said clearly into the phone. "I'm asking why I'm being asked to give up my seat when I violated no rule, shown no aggression, and caused no disturbance. Is this policy? Or is this personal?" The captain didn't answer directly. Instead, he straightened up and said, "Make your decision, sir. Now." The cabin had gone eerily quiet. Even the children had stopped watching their tablet. Everyone was watching. Kendrick looked around, not defiantly, but with a quiet sadness. He thought about his sister waiting for him in Seattle, about his nephew who looked up to him, about all the times he'd chosen peace over principle just to keep things easy, but not this time. "I'm staying in my seat," he said. The captain nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the front. Lorna avoided his gaze as she passed. The flight attendants began their pre-takeoff checks again, but the mood had shifted. The air felt charged, tense. The plane taxied to the runway. The engines roared. They lifted off into the sky. Kendrick stared out the window as Atlanta shrank below him. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded. He hadn't wanted this. He never wanted to be the lesson or the example. He just wanted to go home. But sometimes, just existing with dignity, in the right seat at the right time, refusing to shrink becomes its own kind of courage. And as the clouds rolled beneath the wings, he knew one thing for sure. This flight wouldn't end when they landed in Seattle. It was only just beginning. The moment the plane leveled off, the cabin lights dimmed slightly and the seatbelt sign clicked off. Kendrick felt the weight of what he'd done settle over him. Not regret, but awareness. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't stood up or made a scene. He'd simply said no to something that felt wrong. And yet the air around him had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. Passengers who'd been scrolling, napping, or flipping through magazines now stole glances in his direction. Some looked away quickly when he caught their eyes. Others held his gaze a beat too long, their expressions unreadable. A young black couple near the back exchanged a look that said everything without a word. "We see you. We know." Kendrick kept his eyes on the clouds outside, but his mind raced. He replayed the conversation with the captain, the tightness in Lorna's voice, the way the woman 2 rows ahead never once turned around. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about courtesy. It was about who gets to feel safe and who gets asked to disappear so others can. He thought about calling his sister, but what would he say? "Hey, I'm on a flight where they tried to move me because I made someone uncomfortable, just by sitting there." It sounded absurd out loud, but it was real. And the more he sat with it, the more it burned, not with anger but with a quiet, steady frustration that had been building in him for years. A flight attendant he hadn't seen before, a younger man with kind eyes and a name tag that read Devon, approached with a drink cart. He paused at Kendrick's row, offering water with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You doing okay, sir?" he asked softly, voice low enough that only Kendrick could hear. Kendrick gave a half smile. "Holding up." Devon lingered just a second longer than necessary. "Not everyone agrees with what happened back there," he murmured before moving on. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny crack of humanity in a system that had just treated Kendrick like a problem to be removed. Minutes later, Lorna returned. This time she didn't smile. She stood at the edge of his row, arms crossed, posture rigid. "Captain wants to speak with you again," she said, voice clipped. Kendrick stood slowly, careful not to bump the seat in front. He followed her toward the front galley, aware of every eye tracking his movement. The captain was waiting just outside the cockpit door, arms behind his back, expression unreadable. "Mr. Vale," he began, voice low but firm, "we've received additional concerns. Your presence is causing visible distress to other passengers." "Which passengers?" Kendrick asked. "Because the woman who supposedly felt uncomfortable hasn't looked back once, and I haven't spoken to anyone else." "That's not the point," the captain said, glancing toward the cabin. "Perception matters in the air. If people feel unsafe, that becomes a safety issue." Kendrick shook his head. "That's a slippery slope. If someone feels unsafe because of how I look, that's their bias, not my fault. And it's not fair to punish me for it." The captain's jaw tightened. "This isn't about fairness. It's about control. And right now you're making this harder than it needs to be." The words stung because they were true, and because they revealed the real issue. This wasn't about comfort. It was about control. About who gets to decide who belongs where. Kendrick took a breath. "I'm not trying to make things hard. I'm just asking to be treated like everyone else. If a white man had been in this seat, would you be asking him to move because someone felt uncomfortable?" The captain didn't answer. He just stared, his silence louder than any reply. Back in his seat, Kendrick felt the tension thicken. A few rows behind, a man muttered, "Dude's gonna get us all delayed." A woman whispered to her seatmate, "He's overreacting." But others stayed quiet, watching, listening, maybe even thinking. Then, something unexpected happened. From the window seat across the aisle, an older woman, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, leaned slightly toward him. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Don't let them make you feel small." Kendrick blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected an ally, especially not from someone who looked like she'd spent most of her life in a world that rarely questioned these kinds of requests. "Thank you," he said, voice softer than he intended. She gave a small nod and went back to her book, but the moment stayed with him. It reminded him he wasn't alone, even in a space that felt designed to isolate him. As the flight pressed on, the crew avoided his row. No drink offers, no snack service. When the cart passed, they skipped him entirely, as if he weren't there. It was a subtle punishment, but he noticed. And so did others. A teenage boy in 14D caught his eye and gave a small shrug, as if to say, "Yeah, I saw that too." Kendrick didn't complain. He just kept his phone in his lap, recording intermittently, not to capture drama, but to document truth. He filmed the empty space where the drink cart should have stopped. He filmed Lorna walking past without a glance. He filmed the way the captain checked the cabin every 10 minutes, always pausing near his row. He wasn't trying to go viral. He wasn't planning to post anything online, but he knew deep down that if this ended badly, if they dragged him off the plane or banned him from flying, he'd need proof that he'd done nothing wrong. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light through the windows. The flight attendants began preparing for descent. Still no one spoke to him directly. Still no apology, just silence and sidelong glances. When the captain came over the intercom to announce their approach into Seattle, his voice was calm, professional, like nothing had happened. But Kendrick knew better. The whole cabin knew better. As the plane began its descent, turbulence rattled the overhead bins. People gripped armrests. A child whimpered. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted. The artificial walls between passengers softened. A man in front turned and asked if anyone had gum for ear pressure. Someone passed around mints. For a few minutes, they were just people on a plane, not roles or races or assumptions. But as soon as the wheels touched down and the ding of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin, the distance returned. Remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop, Lorna announced over the PA, her voice crisp and cold. Kendrick stayed put, watching out the window as the terminal grew closer. He wondered what would happen next. Would they stop him at the jet bridge? Would security be waiting? Would they try to ban him from the airline? He wasn't afraid, but he was tired. Tired of having to prove his humanity in spaces that should have welcomed it without question. When the plane finally rolled to a halt, the usual rush to unbuckle and stand began. But no one moved from his row. They waited. Watching him, Kendrick took his time. He zipped his hoodie, tucked his book into his bag, and stood slowly. He made sure to keep his movements calm, deliberate, no sudden gestures, no raised hands. He walked down the aisle with his head high, not defiant, just present. Lorna stood near the exit, arms crossed, eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't look at him. The captain was nowhere to be seen. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, cool Seattle air brushing his face, Kendrick felt a strange mix of relief and resolve. He hadn't won anything flashy. No apology. No reversal. But he hadn't backed down either. And in a world that often asks black men to disappear quietly, that was its own kind of victory. Still, he knew the story wasn't over. What happened in the air couldn't stay in the air. Not this time. He walked through the terminal, past the baggage claim, past the coffee stands and newsstands, his mind already turning over what to do next. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't out for headlines. But he couldn't let this go unchallenged, not for himself, but for the next person who might not have the confidence, the resources, or the support to say no. Outside, his sister's car was waiting. She rolled down the window, her face full of concern. "You okay?" she asked before he even opened the door. He got in, buckled up, and let out a long breath. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay. But I need to make a call." She didn't ask who. She just nodded, put the car in drive, and merged into traffic. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do after being told to move is to stay, and then make sure the truth gets heard. The drive from the airport to his sister's house was quiet. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full. Full of things unsaid. Full of thoughts too heavy to put into words right away. Rain had started falling in soft sheets over Seattle, blurring the streetlights into golden halos on the wet pavement. Kendrick leaned his head against the window, watching the city glide by, his body exhausted but his mind wide awake. His sister, Taryn, didn't press him. She never did. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to help was just to be there, steady, present, not demanding answers before someone was ready to give them. She turned the radio down low, letting the hum of the engine and the patter of rain fill the space between them. It wasn't until they pulled into her driveway, a modest two-story with a porch swing and potted ferns, that she finally spoke. "You want to talk about it?" Kendrick unbuckled his seatbelt slowly. "Yeah, but not yet. I need to make a call first." She nodded, handed him a dry towel from the back seat, and let him sit on the porch while she went inside to start dinner. The cool air felt good on his face. He pulled out his phone, scrolled past a dozen unread messages, some from worried friends, others from colleagues who'd seen a vague post online and found the number he'd saved years ago. Dr. Nia Okoro wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't an activist in the loud public sense. She was a civil rights specialist with the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, a quiet force who'd spent 2 decades holding airlines, rail companies, and transit agencies accountable for discrimination. Kendrick had met her at a transportation equity conference in Chicago, where she'd given a talk on how bias hides in plain sight in customer service policies. He'd stayed after to ask a question, and they'd ended up talking for nearly an hour. Before they parted, she'd handed him her card. "If you ever see something that doesn't sit right," she'd said, "call me. Even if you're not sure." He dialed now, half expecting voicemail, but she answered on the 3rd ring. "Kendrick?" Her voice was calm, familiar. "Hey, Dr. Okoro, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Never," she said. "What's going on?" He took a breath and told her everything, starting from the moment Lorna asked him to move, through the captain's warning, the skipped drink service, the silence, the landing. He kept it factual, not emotional. He mentioned the video, the witness glances, the way the woman never even looked back. He didn't say, "They targeted me because I'm black." He didn't have to. The pattern spoke for itself. There was a pause on the other end. Not skeptical, thoughtful. "You still have the footage?" "Yes, full audio too." "Good, don't post it online yet. Not until we talk next steps." "I wasn't planning to," he said. I couldn't let this go. Not after everything." "I know," she said softly. "And you shouldn't." She asked for the flight number, the names of the crew if he had them, the exact time of the incident. He gave her what he could. Then she said, "I'm going to open a formal complaint today. But Kendrick, this might get loud. Are you ready for that?" He looked out at the rain, at the warm light spilling from his sister's kitchen window. "I didn't ask for it to be loud," he said. "But if staying quiet means this keeps happening to someone else, then yeah, I'm ready." They hung up. Within an hour, Nia had filed a complaint with the DOT's Office of Civil Rights, citing potential violations of federal non-discrimination laws under Title VI and the Air Carrier Access Act. She also sent a copy to the airline's corporate compliance team, with a note that read, "This is not an isolated incident." By morning, the wheels were already turning. Kendrick woke to his phone buzzing nonstop. A local news reporter had gotten wind of the complaint. Someone in the DOT maybe, or a passenger who'd recognized him from the flight. The reporter didn't have the video, but they had enough. "Black engineer asked to move seat on Flight 417. Files federal complaint." He declined the interview. So did Taryn, when a second reporter called her workplace by mistake. But the story was out now, and it spread fast. Not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar. On social media, people began sharing their own stories. A woman in Detroit wrote about being asked to switch seats because a white passenger didn't feel safe near her. A college student in Denver recalled being followed by flight attendants the entire trip after buying a one-way ticket. A retired teacher in Atlanta posted a photo of her boarding pass from 2019 when she was removed from a flight for arguing after being told her natural hair was intimidating. It wasn't just anger people were sharing. It was relief. Relief that someone had finally said, "This isn't right." Relief that they weren't imagining things. The airline issued a vague statement by midday. "We take all passenger concerns seriously and are reviewing the matter internally." It was the kind of corporate language designed to sound responsible while saying nothing at all. But behind the scenes, panic was setting in. Nia had done her homework. She knew this airline had settled 2 similar cases in the past 18 months, both involving black passengers being moved or removed without clear justification. In one, a man was asked to deplane because a flight attendant felt uneasy about his posture. In another, a woman was denied a first-class upgrade despite having elite status, while white passengers with lower status were upgraded ahead of her. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns, and patterns in civil rights law matter more than single incidents. By the second day, pressure mounted. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Travel influencers paused their usual content to amplify the story. Even a few flight attendants, anonymous, but clearly current employees, reached out to Nia with internal memos showing how passenger comfort had been used as a loophole to justify biased decisions. Kendrick still hadn't posted his video. He wanted the facts to lead, not the footage. But he did agree to one thing: a recorded interview with Nia's office for the official record. He sat at Taryn's kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the blinds, and spoke plainly about what happened, how it made him feel, and why he believed it mattered beyond just one flight. "I'm not special," he said into the recorder. "I'm just someone who had the space to say no. But what about the single mom who can't afford to miss a connecting flight? Or the teenager flying alone for the first time? They shouldn't have to choose between their dignity and getting home." Meanwhile, the airline's customer service lines were flooded, not with complaints, though there were plenty, but with demands for transparency. Passengers wanted to know, what's your policy on seat reassignments? Who decides what uncomfortable means? How do you train staff to recognize their own bias? The CEO, a woman named Elena Ruiz, who'd taken over just 6 months earlier with promises of a more human airline, found herself in a crisis she hadn't signed up for, but one she couldn't ignore. On the third day, she called Nia directly. They spoke for 40 minutes. Ruiz didn't deny the incident. She admitted the crew had overstepped. But more importantly, she asked, how do we fix this, not just for Kendrick, but for everyone? Nia didn't offer easy answers, but she did suggest 3 things: immediate suspension of the involved crew pending investigation, a public acknowledgement that the request was inappropriate, and a commitment to revise training protocols with input from civil rights experts. Ruiz agreed to all of it. That afternoon, the airline released a new statement. This one was different. It named the issue. Racial bias has no place in air travel. It confirmed that both the lead flight attendant and the captain had been placed on administrative leave. And it announced the launch of an independent review of all customer service policies related to passenger reassignment and comfort-based decisions. Kendrick read the statement on his phone while sitting on the porch swing, a cup of tea in his hands. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt seen, but the real turning point came that evening. A passenger from his flight, a woman named Priya who'd been sitting in 11B, reached out through a mutual friend. She'd filmed part of the exchange on her phone. She offered to share it with Nia's office and, with Kendrick's permission, to the press. Her video showed everything: Lorna's tight smile, the captain's stern warning, Kendrick's calm refusal. It also showed something else the moment the older woman across the aisle whispered, "You're doing the right thing," and the teenage boy who gave him that knowing look. When the full clip went public the next morning, it changed the conversation. This wasn't just he said, she said. This was proof, and it was human. People weren't just angry, they were moved. Because in Kendrick's quiet dignity they saw their own hopes: to be treated fairly, to stand their ground without being labeled a threat, to exist in public space without apology. Kendrick still hadn't spoken to the media, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't doing this for fame. He was doing it because it needed to be done. And as the story spread from local news to national headlines to international outlets, it became clear. This wasn't just about one man on one flight. It was about who gets to belong in the sky. The airline didn't wait long before making its next move. 2 days after the video went public, both Lorna Briggs and Captain Dale Henshaw were officially suspended. Not just placed on leave, but removed from all flight duties pending a full internal review. The announcement came in a short email to staff and a slightly longer note on the company's website. It didn't use the word fired, but everyone knew what it meant. In an industry where trust is everything, being pulled from active duty over a discrimination complaint was rarely just a pause. It was usually the beginning of the end. Still, the public wanted more than suspensions. They wanted answers. And they wanted accountability that went beyond 2 individuals. That's when the Department of Transportation stepped in, not just with a complaint, but with a formal civil rights investigation. This wasn't routine. The DOT doesn't launch full probes unless there's evidence of systemic issues. And thanks to Dr. Nia Okoro's team, they had it. Internal training documents that vaguely defined passenger comfort as a valid reason for reassigning seats. Past complaints that had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements. Even anonymous crew surveys where flight attendants admitted they'd been pressured to keep certain passengers happy, even if it meant bending the rules. The investigation wasn't just about Flight 417. It was about whether the airline had created a culture where bias could hide behind customer service. Meanwhile, Kendrick tried to return to normal life. He went back to his office in downtown Seattle, where his team greeted him with quiet respect. Not fanfare, just a few nods, a hand on the shoulder. A glad you're okay. He dove into blueprints for a new stormwater drainage system in Tacoma, losing himself in calculations and soil reports. But normal didn't feel the same anymore. People looked at him differently, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet admiration that made him uncomfortable. He hadn't set out to be a symbol. He just wanted to sit in his seat. Then came the call from Evelyn Choate. She hadn't spoken to the press. She hadn't posted anything online. But after days of seeing her name attached to the story, often without context, she reached out through a mutual contact, asking to talk. Kendrick almost didn't take the call, but something made him say yes. Her voice was shaky when she spoke. "I never asked for you to be moved," she said right away. "I swear." Kendrick listened. He didn't interrupt. "I told the flight attendant I felt uneasy," she continued.
"Not because of anything you did,
I saw a man behind me and my mind went to worst-case scenarios. I've been anxious since my divorce. I overreact sometimes." He stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I get that. Fear is real. But when that fear leads to someone else being treated like a threat, just for existing, that's where it gets dangerous." She started to cry. "I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't know they'd ask you to move. I just mentioned it in passing." "Maybe," Kendrick said gently, "that's the problem. We treat these little moments like they don't matter. But they do. Because they add up. And for people like me, they happen over and over. On planes, in stores, in meetings. It wears you down." There was silence on the line. Then softly, "What can I do now?" "Tell the truth," he said. "If they ask you what happened, don't say you requested a seat change. Say you expressed a feeling, and that the crew took it too far." "That's all," she agreed. And later that week, in a brief statement to investigators, she did exactly that. Her words didn't excuse what happened, but they clarified it. The crew hadn't been following a passenger's direct order. They'd interpreted vague discomfort as justification to single out a black man. That distinction mattered. Back at the airline's headquarters, the pressure kept building. Employees began speaking up, not just anonymously, but by name. A group of flight attendants, calling themselves Crew for Equity, released a letter demanding mandatory anti-bias training and clearer guidelines on when seat reassignments are allowed. They pointed out that current policy gave too much discretion to individual crew members, with little oversight. One veteran attendant, a woman named Rosa who'd worked for the airline for 22 years, told a reporter, "We're trained to handle emergencies, not manage someone's prejudice. But if a passenger says they don't feel safe, we're told to resolve it quickly. Too often that means asking the wrong person to move." Her words struck a chord. Because it wasn't just about racism, it was about how systems enable it without ever naming it. The CEO, Elena Ruiz, knew she had to act fast. She called an all-hands virtual meeting with every frontline employee. No scripts, no PR spin. Just her on camera saying, "We failed. Not just on Flight 417, but in how we've trained you, supported you, and protected our passengers. That ends now." She announced 3 immediate changes. First, no seat reassignment would be allowed based solely on comfort or preference, only for safety, medical, or operational reasons. Second, all customer-facing staff would undergo new bias awareness training developed with civil rights organizations. Third, the airline would create a passenger advocacy hotline, staffed by independent mediators, so concerns could be addressed without putting the burden on the person being targeted. The changes weren't perfect. Critics pointed out they didn't address pay disparities or union concerns. But for the first time in years, the airline was admitting fault, not hiding behind isolated incidents. Kendrick watched the announcement from his living room. He felt a flicker of hope but also caution. Policies on paper mean little if they're not lived out in the air. Then came the final blow for Lorna and the captain. After a 2-week review that included interviews with every crew member on the flight, passenger statements, and analysis of cockpit communications, the airline made its decision. Both were terminated, not for poor judgment, as some expected, but for violating federal civil rights standards and creating a hostile environment. The termination letters were clear. Their actions undermined the airline's legal and ethical obligations. The news spread quickly. Some people called it harsh. Others said it was overdue. But what mattered most was the message it sent. Racial bias isn't a mistake you get to walk away from. It has consequences. Kendrick didn't celebrate. He felt sadness more than satisfaction. He'd seen how fear and habit could twist good people into doing harmful things. But he also knew that without accountability, nothing changes. Around the same time, a surprising thing happened. A group of passengers from his flight, 8 of them, started a group chat. They'd exchanged numbers at baggage claim, bonded by what they'd witnessed. They checked in on each other, shared articles. One even sent Kendrick a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." He kept it on his desk. Then, lawmakers got involved. A U.S. senator from Washington referenced the case in a hearing on transportation equity, calling for nationwide standards on how airlines handle bias complaints. The FAA announced it would review whether current regulations adequately protect passengers from discrimination. Kendrick was invited to speak, but not as a victim, as an expert, as someone who understood both engineering and human systems. He declined the first few offers, but when a community college in Tacoma asked him to talk to their engineering students about ethics in design, how even something as simple as a seating policy can reflect deeper values, he said yes. He stood in front of 30 young faces, many of them first-generation students, many of them people of color, and told them, "Your work will shape the world. Not just buildings and roads, but how people move through space, how they're treated, how they feel seen or unseen. Never forget that." Afterward, a young woman stayed behind. "Did you ever think your flight would change things?" she asked. He smiled. "I just wanted to go home." But sometimes doing the right thing, even quietly, ripples further than you imagine. And as he walked back to his car that evening, rain misting the streets again, he realized something. He wasn't just going back to his old life. He was stepping into a new one where his voice mattered not because he'd sought it, but because he'd refused to be silent when it counted. 6 months after Flight 417 touched down in Seattle, Kendrick Vale stood in a small community center in South Seattle, helping a group of high schoolers build a model rain garden. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the air smells like wet earth and coffee, and the sun peeks through clouds like it's deciding whether to stay. The kids, mostly from neighborhoods overlooked by city planners, were arguing good-naturedly over where to place the drainage pipe, their hands muddy, their voices full of the kind of energy that comes from doing something real. Kendrick didn't mention the flight unless someone asked, and even then he kept it simple. "I just wanted to sit where I'd paid to sit." But the truth was, that flight had changed the shape of his life in ways he hadn't expected. The airline's new policies were now in effect. No more seat changes based on comfort, mandatory bias training for all crew, a passenger advocacy line that actually answered calls within 3 rings, and perhaps most quietly powerful, a clause in every employee handbook that read, "Discomfort rooted in bias is not a valid reason to restrict another passenger's rights." It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Lorna Briggs and Captain Dale Henshaw never returned to the skies. Their terminations held. There were no lawsuits, no public appeals, just silence. Kendrick didn't know if they regretted what happened or if they still believed they'd done the right thing. He hoped for their sake it was the former, but he didn't lose sleep over it. His peace wasn't tied to their remorse. What surprised him more was the ripple beyond the airline. Other carriers, some quietly, others publicly, began reviewing their own policies. One major airline quietly updated its crew manual, removing vague language about passenger unease. Another partnered with civil rights groups to co-develop training modules. Even Amtrak and Greyhound issued statements affirming that no passenger should be moved based on another's unfounded discomfort. It wasn't a revolution, but it was movement. Back in his daily life, Kendrick noticed small shifts too. At the grocery store, cashiers looked him in the eye without scanning him for threats. At conferences, people listened when he spoke, not waiting for him to prove he belonged. It wasn't that racism had vanished, but the space to exist without apology had widened just a little. He started saying yes to things he used to avoid. He joined a mentorship program for young engineers of color, meeting monthly with students who reminded him of his younger self. Bright, capable, but sometimes unsure if the room was really for them. He told them stories not just about bridges and drainage systems, but about dignity, about how design isn't neutral. It either includes or excludes, and they had the power to choose. One evening, over video call, his nephew asked, "Uncle K, are you famous now?" Kendrick laughed. "Not even close, but I'm proud." His sister Taryn had framed the handwritten note from the passenger on Flight 417 and hung it in her kitchen. "For the days you forget your voice matters," she'd said. He didn't do interviews often, but when a local public radio show asked him to speak about everyday courage, he agreed. Not to relive the flight, but to talk about what came after. "Courage isn't always loud," he said into the mic. "Sometimes it's just staying in your seat. Sometimes it's making a call the next day. Sometimes it's showing up for kids who need to see someone who looks like them building the future." The episode got more listener emails than any in the station's history. Meanwhile, the Department of Transportation wrapped up its investigation. The final report was thorough, unsparing, and public. It confirmed a pattern of bias in how the airline handled comfort-based complaints, especially involving Black and brown passengers. It recommended not just policy changes, but third-party audits for the next 3 years. The airline agreed, without fight. Dr. Nia Okoro called Kendrick when it was over. "You did more than file a complaint," she said. "You helped reset the standard." He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a witness who finally spoke up. But the most unexpected turn came from within the airline itself. Devin, the young flight attendant who'd quietly told him, "Not everyone agrees," reached out months later. He'd been promoted to a training coordinator role, tasked with helping redesign the new bias awareness curriculum. "I used your story," he admitted. "Not your name, not the details, just the moment. I ask new hires, if you saw this happen, what would you do?" And now more of them say, "I'd speak up." That, more than anything, gave Kendrick hope. Because change doesn't just come from the top down or the outside in. It grows in the quiet choices people make when no one's watching. One afternoon, while walking through a park near his apartment, he saw a man being asked to move from a bench by a security guard, just because he was sitting alone, hood up, minding his own business. The man stayed calm, asked for the reason, and when none was given, he called the park's management line right there on the spot. Kendrick didn't intervene. He didn't need to. The man had his own voice. But as he walked on, he smiled. The ripple was spreading. He still flew occasionally. Never on that airline again, not out of bitterness, but because he'd found others that had earned his trust. And every time he boarded, he noticed the little things. Flight attendants making eye contact with everyone, not just certain passengers. Clear signage about passenger rights near the galley, a general sense that the cabin belonged to all of them. On his most recent trip, a white woman with 2 young kids sat a few rows behind him. Mid-flight, one of her children dropped a toy near his seat. Without thinking, Kendrick picked it up and handed it back with a smile. The mother thanked him, her eyes warm, no hesitation, no fear. It was a tiny moment, but it felt like healing. Back at the community center, one of the students, a girl named Amira with braids and a sharp mind for hydrology, looked up from the model and asked, "Do you think we'll ever build a world where stuff like that flight doesn't happen?" Kendrick wiped his hands on his jeans and thought for a moment. "I don't know if we'll ever get to 0, he said honestly. "But I do know this. Every time someone says this isn't right and means it, every time someone chooses fairness over convenience, we get closer. And you're already building that world, right here." She grinned and went back to adjusting the slope of her miniature hillside. Later that evening, as Kendrick drove home, windows down, city lights reflecting in puddles, he felt a quiet kind of fullness. Not the kind that comes from winning, but from knowing he'd done what his conscience asked of him, and that it had mattered. He hadn't set out to change an industry. He hadn't wanted headlines or apologies. He'd just wanted to go home in peace in the seat he'd paid for. And in the end, that simple act, refusing to disappear, had done more than he ever imagined, because sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with a shout, but with a man staying seated saying calmly, "No, I belong here," and the world slowly starts to listen.